Talk about Lebanon, if you will, as we speak today. I mean, there's a lot happening, right? So now Israel is saying they're going forward with a ground operation. You must take a big breath and wonder how dangerous that will be, and is this really, as the Israeli government spokesman has suggested, going to be a limited operation? Because once these things start, they don't tend to be very limited.
First of all, the intention is important and clear. It is being stated as a limited operation, both in its scope, the amount of forces, and in its length, meaning how long it will take, and how deep they're going into Lebanon. They're talking about cross-border attacks.
So on one hand, in terms of the Israeli bombardment and the number of people killed, this is much bigger than what we saw in 2006 war, which was considered to be a very vicious war. And just to give you one example, in one day, more than 550 Lebanese and refugees were killed. So in one day.
The soul of Hezbollah, he created the machinery of the organization that went on to become, a linchpin of Iran's power projection in the region. He was instrumental in the preservation of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. This week, Lebanon, the Hezbollah, and Israel. And you can't speak about the Hezbollah without discussing Iran. Iran has launched almost 200 missiles at Israel, retaliation for the killing of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. If you want to know more about who Nasrallah was, we lead you through that with Kareem Shaheen. The Israeli ground attack inside Lebanon, displacing more than 1 million people. So we talk to the UN's refugee spokesperson, Rula Amin. But first, former Israeli Army Colonel Miri Eisen. Miri Eisen is a former Israeli Army colonel and was the foreign media advisor for Prime Minister Ehud Olmert in Israel, and she has a background in intelligence. And Miri, I've watched you over the years and greatly value your comments and perspective. First of all, a missile attack from Iran, and that is overtaking events in Lebanon right now. Are you comfortable? Are you safe where you are?
I always feel more comfortable in Israel than anywhere else. This country, in that sense, the Israelis around me, and the defense systems, which are that basic reason why there's been such a difference in just the numbers of casualties, is because of that defense. And I am going to continue to believe in that defense. I think that the Iranians are a horrible threat, and I think that we'll withstand that. So I'm comfortable. If there is an air raid siren, then you'll hear it together with me, and I will go to the safe place inside my own house.
And don't hesitate to run from this interview.
No, it's okay.
What would Iran be trying to accomplish right now? This is payback for Nasrallah?
I'm not even sure if it's Nasrallah or if it's the very high-ranking Iranian Revolutionary Guard that was killed together with Nasrallah. I'll remind everybody that the attack that Iran has already done directly against Israel on the night of April 13th, 14th was done after Israel had killed a top Iranian Revolutionary Guard officer in Damascus. So in that sense, they did it then, and I think they'll do it now. Is it a shorter time period? Well, it's also Hassan Nasrallah. But I would say it's for both, and that is their modus operandi. I can't say I know more than that. I know that most countries do copycat things, meaning I expect something similar to April 13th, 14th, but I don't know.
Gary has said there'll be consequences this time. Israel has capabilities, essentially saying that they're going to hit them back this time. Was there, in the wake of the April attack, in which Britain and America and other allies helped intercept some of those missiles along with Israel, was there a conversation in Israel that Iran should have been penalized in a more serious way?
In Israel, we're constantly talking about the Iranians in that sense, how they're getting out of this with supplying the weapons, giving the ideology, the backing, the training to all of these proxies, all of these missiles, UAVs, suicide drones, you name it. All of them are being supplied by Iran. So certainly it's a question of why are they the ones who get out of it every time? Having said that, Iran is over 1,000 miles away from Israel. And having said that, day before yesterday, Israel attacked in Yemen, and that's also over 1,000 miles away from Israel.
Talk about Lebanon, if you will, as we speak today. I mean, there's a lot happening, right? So now Israel is saying they're going forward with a ground operation. You must take a big breath and wonder how dangerous that will be. And is this really, as the Israeli government spokesman has suggested, going to be a limited operation? Because, once these things start, they don't tend to be very limited.
First of all, the intention is important and clear. It is being stated as a limited operation, both in its scope, the amount of forces, and in its length, meaning how long it will take, and how deep they're going into Lebanon. They're talking about cross-border attacks. Today, then, as we're speaking, and this was Daniel Hagari, Brigadier General IDF spokesperson, has been very busy today. And today, just an hour ago, he posted, and I highly recommend everybody go look at it. He put out a series of short clip movies that are of Israeli troops who have done in the last 200 days, while Hezbollah was attacking Israel, while Israel was acting on the ground in the Gaza Strip and not responding in that sense to Hezbollah. They went into a series of underground attack tunnels that Hezbollah built from Lebanon into Israel. And there's all sorts of different footage of this, of the soldiers going down into them, showing the different weapon arsenals, showing the openings going from the children's room, under the bed, down into the underground tunnel. So when we talk about that ground incursion and the fear of what will happen there, we are already in that sense into that action there, trying to destroy the Radwan force, that's the Hezbollah force, the Radwan force capabilities on the ground so that they will not be able to do an October 7th attack.
Right. And he made a point of that. He made a point of that. He said this is more than just about missiles being fired into Israel, which no country would put up with, but the fact that their intelligence is that they were planning an October 7th style massacre in Israel to be carried out by the Hezbollah.
And they were training for it, and they built all of the attack tunnels, and they had the weaponry for it. That's the motorcycles and the pickup trucks. That's like what looks kind of sexy. I'm talking about the ATGMs, the anti-tank guided missiles, the different type of weaponry, all of the different things. And they have found and exposed, and again, I recommend going to look at it. It's a lot of footage. They've exposed the maps of Hezbollah. The operation was called Operation Liberation of the Galilee. And Hassan Nasrallah himself spoke about this operation, showed maps of it. And we, the IDF forces, have found this in these underground Hezbollah Lebanese tunnels on the Lebanese side in the last few months.
Okay. If we thought the tunnel situation in Gaza was complicated, and you've been fighting in there for almost a year, what could this look like in Lebanon? I mean, it could be a honeycomb of Hezbollah launch platforms and weapon storage that can go on for miles and can draw the Israeli army further and further into a kind of ground hell there.
First of all, we've learned lessons. Over the last 11 months, we've been fighting on the ground in the Gaza Strip in the last 11 months. And the biggest challenge is the combination, Dana, meaning it's not just the underground subterranean, it's also the urban civilian area that's above it. When it's outside in the middle of nowhere, the caves of Osama bin Laden, that's one thing. But we're talking right now, and that's also a terrorist, right? That's also horrible. Here we're talking about all of these different tunnels underneath the towns and villages. And the IDF troops, these are special forces that went into it and took all of this, and you go, why didn't we expose it until now? Because we're fighting a horrible ground war also against the Hamas terror fighters down south. And in that sense, you want to maintain your force. And I think that Israel has been very patient, I would even say very restrained in what it did, considering that Hezbollah, until 2 weeks ago, fired, as you said before, 8,000 rockets into Israel. And in the last 2 weeks, has started firing the mid and long range rockets, including today when I was in an air siren. And now we're waiting for the Iranian rockets and missiles and UAVs and suicide drones to come towards Israel.
Right. It just keeps getting worse. So doesn't that strengthen the position by a lot of diplomats in different countries that say, you're not going to eliminate Hamas. You're not going to eliminate Hezbollah in the north. What you really need is a ceasefire, and then probably some kind of peace plan with Palestinians to put out the fire, not as the flames are spreading right now.
I think that you can say that when you aren't an Israeli. I think you can say that when you are in Canada, the UK, and in Europe and around the world. I live here. And when you look at what was on the other side of the Israeli border, the type of attack that Hezbollah was planning, was implementing, was ready to do, an October 7th attack on steroids times 10 against Israeli communities. And I just want to remind you that the Hamas attack was into Israel and Israeli communities on October 7th. And could it have been worse? Yes, it could have also been Hezbollah. To sit and say ceasefire is to say that we agree that this non-state terror military army, that's what it is, a terror military army, it's not the state's army, has a right to be there, B, that it should deter us. I think that that is actually a horrible thing. It's saying it's okay for Israel to have that on the other side, and at the end, maybe an October 7th will happen. I can't live with that here. You need to destroy the capabilities. It isn't about destroying the ideology, it's about destroying the capabilities. Their ideology calls for our destruction. So all of the lovely people, including myself, who want peace, who want two states, who want a resolution for the Palestinians, I separate between what I'm talking about and between what Hezbollah and Hamas both say, which is the destruction, annihilation of the state of Israel.
You worked for a prime minister who supported a two-state solution.
Absolutely.
Do you have a prime minister now that you think is leading you in a good direction?
It's not about that. At the end of the day, there are 5 million Palestinians who deserve their own future. My problem right now is that the extreme, very extreme ideological voices that don't only say Israel is the worst place on earth, they delegitimize our right to exist. They say we don't have a right to exist. And they also state very clearly in very clear voices that the way to achieve their state instead of Israel is through the use of force. And in that sense, I'm like, I'm going to talk to the people who are willing to talk to me, but I am going to listen after October 7th to those who called for my destruction, because I am one of those who thought that Hamas, as the responsible authority in the Gaza Strip, would change its path. And what I got in my mistake, not just the IDF's mistake and Miri's mistake, is that I thought that they would be responsible and authority. And what they built was years of a kind of plan that Hezbollah has been building, which is to attack, to destroy in a barbaric way. And at the end, the idea is to destroy me. I'm not going to acquiesce with that. I don't think Prime Minister Olmert would acquiesce with that. Having said that, at the end, yes, we will arrive at some kind of resolution. But don't make me the one. Sorry, I'll say this otherwise. I'm not the one who's going to help establish a Palestinian state, and that state is going to call for my destruction. I'm not going to help do that.
Colonel Eisen, will you tell me what your best case scenario is in Lebanon? If you go in, dismantle some of the tunnels, you've already dealt, the Israeli army has already dealt a seismic blow to the leadership of Hezbollah. How does it end in if you paint a rosy picture, what would it be?
Dana, we've been in a war for a year. There are no more rosy pictures. It's a war. War is horrible. So what we're talking about is the scenario that in this war is something that I, for Israel, would see as an achievement. So for me, it would be A, the exposure of what Hezbollah was planning to do without Hezbollah doing it. That's a very important achievement. It hasn't happened until now. For 11 months, I've been talking about Hezbollah. Everybody has talked about the Gaza Strip. And in this case, about the casualties in the Gaza Strip. And I've talked about Hezbollah and they're firing in. I want us to expose what they've done, and that we're starting to do today in a very visual way. Second aspect is to physically destroy the arsenals of weapons, the tunnels themselves, the different aspects that are adjacent to the border. I don't aspire to destroy all of Hezbollah's capabilities in Lebanon, but through exposing it and destroying the ones that are right next to Israel, for me, the best achievement would be to hear world leaders calling Hezbollah a terror organization, understanding what that means.
Which they do.
What it is.
Which most of them do. Well,
I don't know the count, governments
but
do.
many
So
of
you
them
know what?
do.
the achievement would be to not see young, liberal, progressive, amazing young people. I have kids those age who are all fighting right now because they have no choice. And I say that they're not flying a Hezbollah flag because they think that that's cool or neat. Hezbollah is a horrific terror organization supplied and trained by Iran. And yes, the Shiites of Lebanon are oppressed. Let's put a difference between the oppression of the Shiites of Lebanon and between what Hezbollah stands for.
How do you stop going over the next hilltop?
And so
further,
my fear,
deeper, and that's okay. Let's deal with that. Sorry.
So I said that's the scenario that I'd like us to do.
Yeah.
I'll add in that what I'd like it is that we will be the mature adult, and I have no other way to put it, to know that when we've done what we want to achieve, that we stop. This is not about the country Lebanon, the prime minister that everybody seems to vilify, but the prime minister that he has said that himself. Every single person in Israel in authority has said this is not about the country Lebanon. It's not about the people of Lebanon. And I know that sounds horrible because we're attacking in Lebanon, but it's about going in to destroy this terror army, going in to destroy their weapons, their tunnels, their caches, all the different communications and controls, and then be the mature adult and go out. And what I worry is because when you go in, as you said before, you start something, you don't know where it will lead. I'm worried about surprises that Hezbollah has in store for us because everybody prepares surprises and you need to adapt. And that those surprises can be horrific in high intensity warfare. And so I worry about those. And I want to hope that we will still be the mature adult and not just bogged down. I don't want a buffer zone. I don't want us to stay there. I want us to go in, expose and destroy, expose. It's very important. And then to come back out.
Miri, last question to you. You have an intelligence background. You know Lebanon quite well. You've seen this, what a lot of people would describe as a failed state, unable at various times to fill this void and to push its army and take control of Lebanon and create security for Lebanese people, right? Because if there are rockets going over the Israeli border, you know that on the Lebanese side, something's going to be coming back. And so it's up to the Lebanese government to somehow become strong enough to secure Lebanon for its own people. It just seems like we get further and further away from that.
I always wonder how much it's a real crisis. And I wonder how much in that sense. I always say, because we do, as Israelis, get blamed for everything, including, this war is our fault. And I'm like, you're right, we exist. If we didn't exist, everything would be wonderful. That was me being very sarcastic. But when it comes to the country next to us, Lebanon is a complex country. Israel has had a complex relationship. Most Lebanese view Israel as being the one who is the responsible one for all of their woes. And I'm going to say, sadly, we are responsible for some of their woes, but they have lots of woes that have nothing to do with us. Their failure in the last 4 years as a government to put together a government, in that fact that what happened inside the Beirut port, the way that they addressed COVID, their finance crashed and burned, not connected to Israel. I would say to the Lebanese, go and look at Hezbollah. What were they doing both inside the port and in other areas? They're this non-state entity, but they are Lebanese. And I don't have an answer for it. At the end, when I look at all of the Middle East, Lebanon is such a unique, different Middle Eastern country. It has such diverse, different voices. And I hope that they'll come up with one where Israel is not the problem, rather perhaps something joint could become part of a resolution. And I would love to see that. And that's called easier said than done and further away, because right now we are in a real war. Not that we haven't been in a real war we have been for the last 12 months. And all of this is something that we need to address in the future.
Miri Eisen, thank you so much. Great pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
Rula Amin is a former correspondent for CNN and Al Jazeera, and she is now the spokesperson for the UNHCR refugee agency, and she's based in Amman, Jordan. Hi, Rula.
Hello.
You have, so much experience in the region, and I've known you for years, and you've covered a lot of the conflicts. We often headline these stories of what's happening in Lebanon, more refugees on the move. It's a crisis. And I think people's eyes glaze over. Can you give me some perspective on how big this is and how much bigger it may get as is it unfolding as we speak?
So when we talk about how big, there are different issues that we can use to illustrate that. So on one hand, in terms of the Israeli bombardment and the number of people killed, this is much bigger than what we saw in 2006 war, which was considered to be a very vicious war. And just to give you one example, in one day, more than 550 Lebanese and refugees were killed. So in one day. And that's a large number for a very small country like Lebanon that is only about 5 to 6 million people. The other thing is to remember why this is causing so much suffering is that before this crisis began, Lebanon was going through a very severe socioeconomic crisis. Inflation is so high. At $1 used to make, we would exchange $1 for 1,500 Syrian liras. That has jumped between 100,000 and 150,000, sometimes 70,000. But you can...
Yeah, that's financial collapse in Lebanon, really.
A financial collapse. So that means not only people don't have the resources, but also the government's infrastructure to provide basic services has also been crippled. And this crisis it starts in October. We start seeing people displaced, fleeing the bombings, but it was mostly concentrated in the south. And it was a little bit more targeted. So until last week, we saw about 111,000 Lebanese and refugees who had to flee their homes. Mm-hmm. That's, it's a large number, but that happened over months. And then within 1 week, we are now talking about almost, the government says, 1 million people displaced. The UN estimates is more than 300,000, maybe 400,000. Every day the number increases, but it's definitely hundreds of thousands of people who had to flee, which means these people, left their homes in a hurry. They couldn't pick up anything. Basically, some even forgot their civil documents because sometimes they get these warnings from the Israeli army that they need to leave immediately because the bombing is going to start in minutes. So they just run. Many of them, they don't carry any clothes, any spare clothes. And with the expanding of targets and areas that are being targeted by the Israeli army, their choice of what is a safe spot and where is a safe place that we can run to, that choice has been shrinking because the areas that are not being targeted are also shrinking.
Yeah, as we were getting ready to do the interview, sorry to jump in, but the IDF on the ground was ordering the evacuation of at least 27 villages in South Lebanon, north of the Israeli-Lebanese border. And when you look at those 27 villages, it's an area some 30 miles north of the border. That's a huge area.
Yes, and even the bombings before that, had been expanded to other areas like the southern suburbs of Beirut, the Beqa. And one thing to keep in mind too, when we talk about the scope of this conflict, is that before this crisis started, Lebanon hosted at least 1.5 million Syrian refugees who had fled the war in Syria in the past few years, crossed to Lebanon to find safety, to find shelter. They thought they are protecting their families, in addition to Iraqi refugees, Palestinian refugees. So Lebanon used to host the largest number of refugees comparison to its per capita in the world. That's the largest number of refugees hosted in one country per capita in the world. So now we're not looking only at Lebanese who had to flee, but we're also talking about people who fled Syria to come to Lebanon, for example, and now they are reliving the experience. They thought they are bringing their families here to protect them from the violence in Syria, and suddenly they see these bombs falling on them. They run, and they keep on running because every day when they go to one place and the targeting area is expanded, they have to flee again. The government did expand tried to accommodate. So they established these almost 800 makeshift shelters, but it's basically schools that are now housing all these people who fled. But it's not enough because the number, according to the government, is reaching 1 million. We're not so sure. It's all estimates, but it's hundreds of thousands of people. So they have been sleeping in the open air along the Corniche in Beirut. They need everything. They need cash assistance. They need water. They need food. They need mattresses. They need blankets. They need diapers. They need medicine. They need medical care. And most of all, they want to feel safe. They want to be protected. So most of the people have been on the move for days now. Some of them, more than 100,000 at least, and we think the number could be, by the end of today, would jump to 180,000. Most of them, those people, Lebanese and Syrians, chose to cross the border into Syria. So on one hand, you have Lebanese fleeing into Syria, and you have Syrians who fled Syria to Lebanon in the past few years, now finding it that it's better for them to cross back to Syria to try to avoid and escape the violence and the bombs.
Yeah, it's what a disaster. And I was listening to the IDF spokesman, Hagari, did a live news conference, which was carried in many different places. And he went way out of his way to talk about the fact that many of these homes in South Lebanon were staging areas for the Hezbollah. Many of them have tunnels underneath them. Many of them are weapons storage facilities. In essence, he links the people and the population of South Lebanon with the terror, as he calls it, spread by the Hezbollah. So it paints not a very good picture of the people who are on the move. But you can't do that to 1 million people, can you?
I'm here representing a humanitarian agency, and so what we say in these situations is that no matter what are the circumstances, the protection of civilians during conflict is stipulated by international law. And that law had been put there specifically to address situations like intense conflicts, like what's happening now. The warring parties have a duty. They must do everything possible to avoid targeting civilians, and they need to ensure the protection of civilians. What we are seeing on the streets of Lebanon, in the shelters, are whole families, women, children, teenagers, elderly, so all kinds of populations on the run and fleeing. And what they're telling us is they feel that the civilian population, has borne the brunt of this conflict and this war so far. And every day the conflict continues, there will be more people who are losing their lives, more people displaced. The needs will grow more. Now, a humanitarian aid agency like UNHCR, we're on the ground, and we've been in Lebanon for decades, mostly helping vulnerable refugees and Lebanese. Now, we're still on the ground, providing water, providing blankets, mattresses, sleeping mats, helping repair shelters, helping equip these makeshift schools on how to be safe for people to come in. But that's not enough, because the numbers increase by the day, and so are their needs. So today, the UN humanitarian agencies in Lebanon, they made this appeal to the international community, and they said, we need over $420 million to be able to respond to the needs of this displaced population and the people who have not been displaced. Because there are people who are still in their homes, but maybe get displaced, but they can't go to work. They need aid. I'll give you an example. Those people, for example, who cross the border into Syria. So I have UNHCR colleagues who are on the ground in Syria, and they are trying to help. So we provide water, food, blankets, mattresses. We establish these big tents, rub holes, we call them, for people to stay in and to spare them the sun as they are being processed. But we're giving them this kind of assistance on the day they arrived. And they arrive exhausted, traumatized. Many of them have reached the border by foot. Those who even took transportation, it took them hours to get to the border. And they really don't have a plan for the next day. They don't know what will their next day look like. As we are speaking, like early this morning, there was an Israeli attack on the capital, Damascus. Now, this is one of the areas that these people who are fleeing the bombing in Lebanon are heading to. So it's really becoming, you feel that the Lebanese, the refugees who are hosted in Lebanon, they're all stuck in this very cruel situation where they can't find safety anywhere. Lebanon is a very small country, and they don't have the means, to buy a plane ticket and go to Cyprus, for example. They don't have the means to rent an apartment because of the economic situation that was prevailing inside Lebanon before this. So you can see that the civilian population is really there. They have been suffering immensely. They are terrified, feel very vulnerable, and they need urgent help.
I put you on the spot and ask you to predict where this is going to go, because as news correspondents, we covered lots of these, right? And they are different every time, and they are distinct every time, but they are also, some of them run in parallel with one another. The Israelis are saying limited ground operation. Raids, they are using the term raids, which would suggest they go in with special forces, they try to dismantle part of the Hezbollah launch areas and staging areas, and then they maybe go out again. The reality is, in past conflicts in Lebanon, they don't, the go out part, the go back part is long delayed and doesn't happen in some cases for years. That is a very big problem for several million people.
Yes, we work with UNHCR, we work with refugee situations around the globe. And unfortunately, in the past years, the number of years where people stay displaced before it becomes safe to go back for them to their original towns and villages is now almost 10 years. That's a long time. It's a long time because people, when they run, they have nothing with them. In the beginning, the international community sometimes is committed and they start providing assistance. But with every passing year, the support for them decreases while their needs increase, because whatever means they had, even if they had sold their own golden bracelets, they have exhausted their personal means to be able to survive.
And they're out of the headlines, and support decreases. People tire of it. Who it may be charitable in the beginning, but over time,
and when crisis emerges, it's in the headlines because of the politics, and they are forgotten. And then they're left on their own to try to make ends meet, to protect their children. When we say we don't have the resources to meet all the needs, that's a dangerous situation, because what does it mean? It means these families, they stop eating proper food, or the parents stop eating so that they can feed their children. The nutritious food is not available anymore. When the kids get sick, they can't take them to a doctor. They sometimes have to drop out of school because they need to go to work to assist the parents. Mm-hmm. These are consequences that affect not only the present time, but it has effect throughout generations of people in the region and beyond. The Syria crisis, for example, it's been going on for 13 years. And until this day, there are 7.2 million people displaced inside Syria. And there are more than 5 million Syrian refugees just in the countries surrounding Syria: Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq, and Egypt. That's a huge number. That means there are generations of children who hadn't been able to go to school, who had not had the right food to be healthy. And this will affect the whole region. It doesn't affect this one population.
So you really, when you listen, even if there is sympathy for Israel, which has had shelling on its northern border for a year, since October 7th, and the Hamas raid into southern Israel and the kidnapping of Israelis, even if you sympathize with the fact that Israel has a right to take action against the Hezbollah, you have to discuss proportionality. And thus the calls around the globe by many different governments calling for a ceasefire now, because they're saying you're never going to dismantle Hezbollah, all of it. And you can't do this to the people now that are caught in the crossfire. You can only go so far, and they are probably already going far enough by launching this ground operation today as we speak.
You know, as a humanitarian agencies where we are on the ground in so many different conflicts, we always say humanitarian aid cannot end the suffering of people. It can only ease some of it.
Mhm.
But the only way, the only solution to end people's suffering and the consequences is to end these conflicts. And to be, you know, to be proudly more blunt, is to try to preempt these conflicts and avoid them erupting from the first place. Because the minute it starts, it's so hard to roll the ball back. And now what we are dealing with in Lebanon is displaced Lebanese, displaced refugees who are making very difficult choices on where to go and how can they go, who will receive them, what is a safe spot. So we are saying this as people have, you know, carry their children from one street to another, from one corner in Beirut to another, trying to stay safe. They hear the news. The minute you hear about a ground invasion, they are not sitting there and assessing whether it's going to be limited 5 kilos, 10 kilos. All they know is that this is an escalation. It's going to be to bring more intensification of the bombing and duration of this war. And they run again. They are so terrified.
And by the way, even if you get a ceasefire, and you know this better than me, even if you get a ceasefire in place, what are they going to have to go back to?
That's another thing. You know, our colleagues met people who are Syrian refugees who were crossing the border back to Syria. And we asked them, where are you going? And they said, we don't know. All we know is that we're running from the bombs. We will try to get to our towns and villages. We're not sure if our homes are still standing. But for today, this is what we're doing to run away from the violence.
Yeah, and I guess any of us who have children and loved ones, you just try to move your family and get the hell out of an emerging hell around you. So,
and you know, there's so many civilians who have been killed, and it's not something that one has to work very hard to prove. We lost 2 of our colleagues in UNHCR. One is a UNHCR colleague who has been working with UNHCR for 12 years. She was at her home during in the Beqa. The airstrike hit her building. Her husband and one of the children were rescued, but they are in a critical situation. And she and one of her children, you know, they passed away. We lost them under the rubble. We have another colleague also who was in a cafe. It got struck, and he was killed. So we know of many cases where these people the civilians are paying a very, very high price for this conflict, and they just want it to end. For now, they're looking for a safe spot. They want to protect their children. They need all kinds of assistance, and that's why we say, you know, we call on the international community, countries with influence like the United States. We always say we have 2 appeals. One is to provide the financial resources that are needed for us to be able to continue meeting the needs, to continue delivering assistance. And the other thing is to pressure the parties to end this today before tomorrow.
Yeah, because they're just going to get in deeper and deeper, Rula. And you and I have covered conflicts like that, and the idea of any short war, you know, I haven't seen one, even though they're always headlined as that, and limited incursions. So, Rula Amin with the UNHCR. Rula, it's great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Very much. Thanks for having me.
Kareem Shaheen is a letters editor for New Lines magazine, and he joins us from Quebec, Canada. Hi, Kareem. And I should mention you were a Guardian reporter, and you were based in Beirut for many years.
Correct. Thank you for having me, Dana. Yeah, I was based in Beirut for The Guardian, and then later on in Istanbul. And right now I'm the newsletters editor, but also the Middle East editor at the magazine. So I'm kind of responsible for our Middle East coverage, and we do mostly long form journalism. You know, for people who want something a little bit more.
Not long enough, because just before the interview, I was telling you have to write your book now. So you
right
started. So let me ask you, you've written an essay that I read the other day on the killing of Hassan Nasrallah which I consider to be a significant event because he's the head of Hezbollah. But you was sort of way beyond, probably, and see him as a much weightier leader than maybe we give him credit for.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, I think his influence over Hezbollah was very much, as we said in the piece, the soul of Hezbollah. He created the machinery of the organization that went on to become, a linchpin of Iran's power projection in the region. He was instrumental in the preservation of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria through his intervention of it. He's very much a figure that was ever present, that was culturally incredibly significant for both Lebanon and for the rest of the region. Whether you hated him or whether you supported his campaign, against Israel or in support of Iran's goals in the region. It's enough to consider that for the past year, Hezbollah has essentially launched the longest lasting war against Israel by any Arab force. And he was obviously instrumental in Israel's withdrawal from Lebanon back in 2000. Israel's occupation of Lebanon starting in 1982 was a key event that led to the creation of Hezbollah. Up until the early 2010s, Hezbollah's leader was probably the most popular Arab leader in the region. His legacy, obviously in Lebanon, was very complicated because of the brutality that Hezbollah visited on its opponents inside the country, the political assassinations they carried out against liberal politicians who opposed them and who opposed their stranglehold over Lebanon. And obviously for the people who saw them as a sectarian militia primarily, rather than a movement that was meant to resist Israel's occupation. And they had the guns, so they could always intimidate anyone that opposed them inside Lebanon. But for the rest of the region, up until 2011, he was someone who was seen as one of the few Arab leaders who was willing to stand up to Israel and to its actions in the region. But after the war in Syria began and Hezbollah joined,
I wanted to ask you about Syria because that's where the love for Nasrallah, if there is love for him in the Middle East, turns pretty sour. I mean, he is responsible for the killing of tens of thousands and helping the Assad regime in Syria for killing tens of thousands of Syrians during the Syrian civil war.
Correct. Yeah, we compared Nasrallah in the piece to Gamal Abdel Nasser, the infamous ex-Egyptian president who was very much synonymous with the dream of pan-Arab nationalism and the unification of the Arab world. Nasser lost every single war he went to with Israel, but he's still revered by many figures in the region, by many ordinary people in the region. Nasrallah occupied a very similar space. They carried out immense brutality against their opponents in Lebanon, but they also trafficked in this currency that that according to them represented Arab dignity. Which is that there were no Arab leaders who were willing to stand up to Israel except for Nasrallah and before him Nasser. The fact that he ended up joining the war in Syria, I mean, Hezbollah carried out some horrible crimes in the course of the conflict. They starved Syrian civilians in this border town called Madaya that for a brief amount of time was the focus of international media attention. Literally besieging people and starving them to death. And in addition to the fact that they just they propped up this regime, it was in defense of the indefensible. As we said in peace. At that point, Hezbollah became much more broadly seen in the region as an instrument of Iranian power projection and essentially a sectarian militia that was no different than any other brutal occupation in the region.
So, can you explain this paragraph that you wrote in the essay? And I'll just read it. He provided the ideological and operational template for militias and Islamist groups that stretched far beyond Hezbollah. Even extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State group have borrowed from his playbook imitating Hezbollah's ability to merge military action with political legitimacy and mass mobilization, and even emulating his style and persona. I mean, what was so different about what he was doing?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, Hezbollah, has always been a dual political and military organization in Lebanon. It was a grassroots organization that, yes, they became an Iranian client, but they were founded due to real grievances, in Lebanon, whether that had to do with the ongoing civil war and the destruction that what was happening in Lebanon in the 1980s, whether it has to do with the Israeli occupation of Lebanese land, and whether it had to do with the marginalization of Shiites in Lebanon, who were always, kind of not part of the elite power structure in the country. So Hezbollah had, there were real grievances on the ground that led to Hezbollah being created as this grassroots movement that still has roots all across South Lebanon and the southern suburbs of Beirut, where the party's constituents lived and were based. But in addition to that, there was a lot of logistical efforts. I mean, Hezbollah was, for the longest time seen as this crown jewel in Iran's militia network, and for good reason. They had established this deterrence to the arch enemy that even all these terrorist groups that terrorize civilians all across the region, they still claim that to be their highest ideal, the liberation of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Hezbollah was one of the few militias that was actually in combat with Israel on a regular basis. They went
in
out
a
of
fearsome way, and put the Israeli army back on their heels more than once.
Correct, and that's why for them, they used to tout the 2006 war as the divine victory, even though much of Lebanon was destroyed in the course of Israel's aerial campaign over Lebanon and over Beirut. They were able to hold the Israelis to a standstill, and they won by denying Israel the aims that they had stated, when they launched the 2006 campaign. But Hezbollah has used this position, as a way to also spread its influence far and wide. They were training all these Iraqi militias, Iraqi Shiite militias. They were, training the Houthis in Yemen. They obviously, intervened in the war in Syria and were an instrumental part of the campaign there, and of training other groups and professionalizing them to allow for greater Iranian power projection in the region. So they both inspired those groups and directly were directly involved in improving their capabilities.
But and over your many coffees and getting to know the Lebanese as well as you did by being based in Beirut, was there a lot of resentment in different areas of Lebanon of the state within the state? I mean, the Hezbollah essentially has hijacked the state, not allowed government to function, has been a violent organization within Lebanon itself.
Correct. Yeah, and but as with anything Lebanon, it was a polarizing question. There were people who directly benefited, obviously, from Hezbollah's power. There were people who, would think of the struggle against Israel as being the paramount cause in the Arab world, and so they were prepared to overlook, Hezbollah's crimes in Syria and its assassination of opposition politicians because it was in service of preserving this resistance to Israel. And obviously, there were the victims of Hezbollah's actions, whether that was the Lebanese politicians and their families who were killed by Hezbollah, whether it was the people who felt that Lebanon's development and Lebanon's realization of Lebanon's potential, both politically and economically, was stymied by Hezbollah's allegiance to a foreign power. There were the Lebanese nationalists, who felt that the country should be sovereign, that the nation state should be sovereign and that it should have power over its foreign policy and its borders, and therefore, Hezbollah should be disarmed because it was bullying the rest of the Lebanese. So and there were obviously the people who saw it in more religious terms, that Hezbollah was essentially a Shiite millenarian movement that preserved Shiite supremacy both in Lebanon and across the rest of the region. So there were many diverse viewpoints on this, there wasn't one belief one way or the other that predominated.
How earth-shaking do you think the assassination of Nasrallah, many of the top leaders, many others are in hospital, even low-level lieutenants, field lieutenants are in the hospital because of, with these explosion of pagers. This is pretty jarring to that organization. How debilitating is it? And followed up as we speak, the Israelis are launching a ground war today, however limited they claim it may be.
Yeah, it's enormous. I mean, there's no denying that this was an enormous victory for Israel and a major defeat for Hezbollah. I think Hezbollah is facing a crossroads right now. The party and the movement is trying to absorb the shocks, the repeated shocks, in fact. If you look back, it's only been a week since the Pagers attack, which was an extraordinary event.
This is moving at lightning speed.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, it's an extraordinary event. In Israel's decapitation of the leadership is not something that is just limited to Nasrallah, obviously. As you alluded to, they essentially assassinated the entirety of the top military echelon of the party and a lot of their political leaders. Whether how much of the command and control structure continues to exist, who's calling the shots, who's going to call the shots in a few weeks, is very much an open question. And I think Hezbollah is on the defensive right now. They're in the position where they're trying to absorb all of these shocks and trying to see if the party survives intact after this campaign is over, and whether this campaign ends up being over. But it is worth remembering that Hezbollah was born out of Israel's ground invasion of Lebanon in 1982.
They changed out the PLO and they got the Hezbollah.
Correct. And so, what the Israelis end up with after Hezbollah, post Nasrallah, is very much an open question. The ground invasions are very finicky. There's always another hill to take over because the guys over the next hill are threatening your positions. An
army gets sucked in further and further.
Correct. Yeah, and as the Economist correspondent in Israel, Ansha Pfeffer, said today, Israel is very good at is very good at invading, but they don't always have an exit plan, and whether that exit plan comes under the guns of the next iteration of whatever movement emerges out of the ashes of the conflict right now is very much open to question.
Is there a big danger there for Israel, do you think, when you look at what happened to American forces in Iraq, for instance? There are militias that are sympathetic to the Hezbollah in Iraq, in Syria. They are funded, they are trained by Iran. This doesn't easily end, and if Israel wades too deep in that water, I wouldn't say they would drown, but I would say that they can find themselves in fighting for air.
Look, I mean, the challenge is that there's no denying that what Israel achieved over the past week, in Lebanon anyway, is an immense strategic and tactical success. I mean, they perceived Hezbollah as their greatest rival in the region, in the immediate neighborhood anyway, outside of Iran. And they truly kneecapped the party. Like right now, the party does not have the capacity to respond to Israel in the same way it would have if it still retained its leadership, if it still retained its arsenal. And so Israel is going to take the lesson from this that violence does work, as a solution. The problem is that Israel is kind of stumbling from operation to operation, where they see everything as the square peg problem, where violence is the only solution to everything. And so they're lurching from war to war, from military operation to military operation, without any end game in sight. and eventually this will catch up to them, because if you alienate all of your neighbors, if you alienate all the partners potentially, for peace by going ahead and invading Lebanon, or assassinating all of these top leaders, the thing is, what the Israelis have proven is that nobody's out of reach, right? They assassinated Qasem Soleimani back in 2020. It was the Americans assassinated Qasem Soleimani back in 2020, and Iran did not respond. Then Israel assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, a few months ago,
In Iran.
nothing happened. Exactly. And now it was Nasrallah's turn, and so the Israelis are very much saying that nobody's out of our crosshairs. And eventually, this orgy of violence, what is it going to lead to? What is the end game as a result of it? Ismail Haniyeh's assassination led to Nasrallah's assassination and the assassination of Hezbollah's top military echelons. Nasrallah's assassination now leads to a ground invasion. And then what will the ground invasion lead to after that? So there's clearly no end game that the Israelis have, even if the violence is working in the short term. And so if there is no plan for what peace looks like in the aftermath of all of this violence, then where are we going? What's the end goal? I think it's a huge problem, and there are no scenarios that are out of the imagination now, because Israel is ready to do anything. I mean,
what would be your worst case scenario?
If Israel continues along this path, you very quickly end up in a situation where the only way to stability and peace in the region may be mutually assured destruction. If Israel perceives that it has the power and the righteousness and the ability to pursue all of these enemies through these military means, then the only way to deter Israel, and this includes also its Gulf partners, and other states that don't have a quarrel with Israel. But if Israel is willing to pursue these sorts of military aims against any organization or state or party that opposes Israel's regional policies, then the only deterrent is for everyone to have nuclear weapons. Everyone to have an arsenal that can have the capacity to deter Israel truly from military adventurism.
I guess Israel would melt this down right now, though, and say, hey, they've been shooting rockets at us for a year over our northern border. The shooting has to stop. No, and we don't care if they're in support of Palestinians in Gaza or not. No country would put up with that, and that's what we're going to do. And a lot of people will sympathize with that.
Correct. Yeah, and that's what the Americans are saying right now. Which is that we don't want a regional war in the Middle East, but Israel has the right to defend itself. But equally, if you consider the other side of it, Israel is essentially terrorizing much of Lebanon. I mean, the attacks are not limited to the south, where they want to establish deterrence over there. There's 1 million Lebanese civilians who have to flee their homes.
And that rolls off our tongues pretty quick, right? But 1 million people on the move, who will probably have no homes to go back to, by the way, even if you get a ceasefire in place now, because a lot of it's being destroyed. And it's only a small country.
It's 1 million people out of a population of 4 million. It's literally a quarter of the country has fled, as a result of these attacks. Some 100,000 people have crossed over into Syria, for God's sake. That's where they're seeking shelter and safety. And this is a country that's been in economic freefall for years. Where everyone is impoverished, where the country has been suffering for such a long time. And don't get me wrong, I think that the solution right now is for for the space to be created for Lebanon to reclaim its own sovereignty. This is a golden opportunity, I think, for the Lebanese states to be empowered, for the Lebanese military to take control over its borders. Except, nobody cares. The only thing that matters is those short-term gains of, which leader has been assassinated, which bombing operation has been successful, and the chest beating part of war, and nothing else matters. No political solution, nothing.
Wouldn't that be wonderful for Lebanon if this is a turning point, inflection point, to steal somebody else's term? If this is a great inflection point for Lebanon to take sovereignty and control and to be able to get its government working again and remove, Hezbollah has been part of the paralysis there.
Correct. Yeah. But except, in all of these situations, the region is run by middle managers. It's not run by actual leaders with a vision. Netanyahu's lurching from war to war because it's essential for his political survival currently, and there is no end game in place. And so this idea that we might look for an opportunity or a silver lining within this absolute catastrophe that's occurring, and trying to figure out a way for the Lebanese state to exist in its aftermath is very much not a question that's on the mind of Western policymakers or Israeli policymakers, largely because Arab lives don't really matter. It's
in
unfortunate.
In their view.
Correct. Yeah, of course. Yeah. As an Arab myself, I certainly hope that my life does matter. But it's an unfortunate reality in this world that Hezbollah is paying for its crimes against Lebanese civilians and against Syrian civilians in the form of bunker buster bombs, 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs provided by the United States, being dropped on one of the poorest parts of Beirut, and vaporizing 6 or 7 apartment buildings in the process. And nobody's talking about that. Nobody cares about the people who were there because Nasrallah was the ultimate target, and he was killed, and that's obviously a monumental event for the region.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is that it was a mass casualty event in which a huge number of civilians was vaporized by it, and that the number of people who've been killed in Lebanon already rivals the number of people who died in the entirety of the 2006 war, which lasted a whole month. And the same number of people have already been killed in about a week of hostilities.
And unfortunately, if I would add my comment, none of these conflicts, whether it be in Gaza or the West Bank or in Syria or in Lebanon, none of them, unfortunately, end with moderates being strengthened. It's people who are very angry, who have lost loved ones. It breeds and empowers hatred in the region. And Netanyahu, despite standing on a podium saying he's just defending northern Israel right now, has probably not been one of the greatest detractors from any kind of peace process with Palestinians and others. So
you're absolutely right. The Jordanian foreign minister was at the UN recently, and the UN General Assembly meetings, and he sounded incredibly irritated by questions related to peace in the region, because he was saying that I'm representing a group of countries that have repeatedly said that they're willing to guarantee Israel's security, that they're willing to completely normalize with Israel in exchange for a Palestinian state. And the reality is that the agenda that Netanyahu is pursuing in the region of this perpetual war is because he does not want a two-state solution. He does not want a solution for the Palestinians. He wants to win it all. And he does not have an end game in sight, and as a result, we're suffering from
our next interview with Kareem is going to be, what does win it all mean? But nobody's quite sure what that looks like. But probably just stagnation and ignoring the Palestinian problem, which Netanyahu has done for his entire career. But hey, man, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Do the Lebanese book and let me know.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care.
And that's our backstory this week. Thanks to our terrific guests. If you like the podcast, share it with someone else. I'm Dana Lewis. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.